On the night of April 19, 2018, Walter Leroy Moody Jr. lay strapped to a gurney inside Alabama's Holman Correctional Facility. At exactly 8:42 p.m., the state of Alabama carried out his execution by lethal injection. He was 83 years old, making him the oldest person executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. His crimes had haunted the country for nearly 3 decades. In December 1989, Moody launched a calculated mail bombing campaign that killed 2 people and nearly claimed more. One victim was Judge Robert S. Vance, a highly respected federal appeals court judge. The other was Robert E. Robinson, a prominent civil rights attorney in Georgia. 2 more bombs, destined for a federal courthouse and the NAACP, were intercepted just in time. At first, the attack seemed racially motivated, but as the investigation unfolded, it became clear. This wasn't political extremism. This was deeply personal. This was vengeance. Moody had spent years nursing a grudge against the courts after a 1972 conviction for a previous bombing that injured his first wife. He wanted payback, and he wanted chaos. The search for the bomber became one of the largest federal manhunts in FBI history. It involved bomb experts, postal inspectors, and wiretaps. What came later, his trial, his conviction, his time on death row, and his final hours, would raise even more questions. His last meal and final actions before death weren't just routine. They were revealing. You'll hear them later in this story, and when you do, they'll mean something far deeper. But to understand why the federal government and the state of Alabama pursued this man so relentlessly, we have to go back. Back to a broken marriage. Back to a 1972 explosion that nearly killed his wife. Back to the bitter seed that would grow into one of America's most sinister revenge plots. Back to the very beginning of Walter Leroy Moody Jr. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences, and the darkest corners of human decision. Hit the like button, tap the notification bell, and stay with us as we uncover the twisted path that led Walter Leroy Moody Jr. to death row. Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was born on March 24, 1935, in Rex, Georgia, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The oldest of 3 children, Walter grew up in Fort Valley with his parents and younger siblings. His father worked at the local peach orchards, and his mother kept house like most women of that era. From an early age, Walter showed an unusual fascination with taking things apart and putting them back together. He spent hours in the family's backyard shed, dismantling old radios, clocks, and whatever mechanical devices he could find. His parents initially thought this was just normal curiosity, but Walter's obsession with machinery went beyond typical childhood tinkering. In 1953, Walter graduated from Peach County High School. He was not particularly popular or outstanding academically, but his teachers remembered him as a quiet student who kept to himself. After graduation, he enlisted in the military, serving in various positions from 1953 to 1961. The structured environment of military life seemed to suit him, and he performed his duties without incident. The military years provided Walter with discipline and technical training. He learned about explosives and ordnance disposal as part of his service, knowledge that would prove crucial decades later. Fellow servicemen described him as competent, but distant, someone who followed orders but never formed close friendships. When Walter left the military in 1961, he returned to Georgia with ambitions that exceeded his abilities. He enrolled in a small college, initially hoping to pursue medicine. Walter told people he wanted to become a neurosurgeon, but his grades were poor. The demanding coursework and complex scientific concepts proved too challenging for him. After failing to make progress in medical studies, Walter shifted his focus to law. He managed to enroll in some law school classes, though he never completed a full program. The legal system fascinated him, particularly the appeals process and how cases moved through the courts. He spent countless hours reading legal texts and court decisions, believing he could master the law through self-study. In 1967, Walter underwent a psychiatric evaluation that revealed troubling aspects of his personality. Dr. Thomas M. Hall, the evaluating psychiatrist, noted that Walter harbored violent thoughts and fantasies. The doctor expressed concern about Walter's potential for destructive behavior, stating he was constantly afraid that Walter might eventually harm society. Despite these warning signs, Walter appeared to function normally in his daily life. He married his first wife, Hazel, and they settled into what seemed like a typical suburban existence. However, beneath the surface, Walter was building resentment toward various institutions and individuals who he felt had wronged him. On May 7, 1972, Hazel Moody made a discovery that would change her life forever. Walking into her kitchen, she found a small package that seemed out of place. The package was addressed to her husband, while something about it made her curious enough to open it herself. The moment Hazel lifted the lid, the package exploded. The homemade pipe bomb tore through her hand, thigh, and shoulder, sending metal fragments throughout the kitchen. One piece of shrapnel lodged in her eye, causing immediate and severe damage. The explosion was loud enough to bring neighbors running to the Moody home. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the damage was extensive. Hazel required immediate surgery and would undergo 6 separate operations over the following months. The doctors worked to save her eye and repair the damage to her hand and leg. The physical scars would heal, but the emotional trauma would last much longer. Walter's reaction to his wife's injuries was unusual. Rather than showing the expected concern and grief, he seemed more interested in the technical aspects of what had happened. He asked detailed questions about the bomb's construction and how it had functioned. This behavior struck investigators as strange. The investigation into the bombing began immediately. Federal agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms joined local police in examining the crime scene. The bomb's construction was sophisticated, requiring knowledge of explosives and electronics. This was not the work of an amateur. Investigators discovered that the bomb had been intended for an auto dealer who had recently repossessed one of Walter's cars. The dealer had been involved in a dispute with Walter over the repossession, and Walter had made threats about getting revenge. The bomb was apparently meant to be delivered to the dealer's office. The question of how the bomb ended up in Walter's kitchen became central to the investigation. Walter claimed he had no knowledge of the device and suggested that someone else must have placed it there. However, investigators found evidence that Walter had been experimenting with explosives in his backyard shed. Neighbors reported seeing Walter working with chemicals and electrical components in the weeks before the explosion. He had purchased materials that could be used to make explosives, including pipes, end caps, and batteries. The evidence suggested that Walter had been building bombs for some time. The case went to trial in October 1972. Walter's defense was that he had not intended to make a bomb and that the explosion was accidental. The prosecution argued that Walter had deliberately constructed the device to harm the auto dealer and that his wife's injuries were the result of his criminal activity. The trial of Walter Moody in October 1972 drew significant attention in Georgia's legal community. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Walter had purchased materials used in the bomb's construction and had been conducting experiments with explosives in his backyard shed. Forensic experts testified about the bomb's sophisticated design. The device used threaded rods to secure end plates, a technique that required specific knowledge and skill. The prosecution argued that this level of sophistication proved the bomb was deliberately constructed, not accidentally created. Walter's defense team argued that he had been tinkering with mechanical devices as a hobby and that the explosion was unintentional. They portrayed him as an amateur inventor whose experiment had gone wrong. The defense emphasized that Walter himself had been the victim, as his wife was the one injured in the blast. The jury deliberated for several hours before reaching their verdict. On October 19, 1972, they found Walter not guilty of making the bomb with intent to harm the auto dealer. However, they convicted him of possessing an explosive device, a federal crime that carried a significant prison sentence. Walter was sentenced to 5 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The conviction meant he would have a federal criminal record, something that would follow him for the rest of his life. More importantly, it introduced him to the federal court system that would later become the target of his revenge. The conviction had immediate consequences for Walter's personal life. Hazel divorced him shortly after the trial, unable to cope with the knowledge that her husband had been responsible for her injuries. The divorce was bitter, and Walter blamed the legal system for destroying his marriage. During his time in prison, Walter became obsessed with his case and the legal system that had convicted him. He spent countless hours in the prison library, reading legal texts and studying the appeals process. He filed numerous motions and appeals, all of which were denied. Walter's fellow inmates noted his intense focus on legal matters. He would discuss his case with anyone who would listen, always insisting that he had been wrongly convicted. His obsession with proving his innocence consumed much of his time and energy. The appeals process introduced Walter to the structure of the federal court system. He learned about the various levels of courts and how cases moved through the system. This knowledge would prove crucial in his later crimes, as he would know exactly which judges and courts to target. Walter Moody's release from federal prison in 1977 marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Upon his release, Walter struggled to rebuild his life. His criminal record made it difficult to find employment, and his reputation in the community was permanently damaged. He blamed the legal system for these problems, refusing to accept responsibility for his own actions. Walter married his second wife, Susan McBride, in the early 1980s. Susan was unaware of the depth of Walter's anger toward the legal system. She saw him as a man who had been wrongly convicted and deserved a second chance. Walter carefully concealed his violent thoughts and his growing plans for revenge. The 1980s brought Walter into contact with the federal court system once again. He continued filing appeals and motions related to his 1972 conviction, seeking to have his record expunged. These efforts brought him before various federal judges, including Robert Vance of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Robert Smith Vance, born in 1931 in Talladega, Alabama, was a respected federal judge known for his sharp legal mind and commitment to public service. A graduate of the University of Alabama and George Washington University Law School, he also served in the U.S. Army's JAG Corps. Vance built a strong legal career in Birmingham, handling civil rights and constitutional cases with fairness and precision. He was married to Helen Rainey Vance, with whom he had 2 sons, and lived in Mountain Brook. His judicial philosophy emphasized independence, rule of law, and unwavering adherence to precedent. Judge Vance presided over one of Walter's appeals in the mid-1980s. The case was routine from the court's perspective, but Walter saw it as another example of judicial bias against him. When his appeal was denied, Walter's resentment focused specifically on Judge Vance. Walter began researching the judges who had ruled against him. He learned about their backgrounds, their families, and their daily routines. This research would later prove crucial in planning his attacks. He studied the structure of the federal court system and identified potential targets. The obsession with his case consumed Walter's life. He spent hours each day reading legal documents and planning new appeals. Susan noticed that Walter's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, but she attributed it to the stress of his legal battles. Walter's anger extended beyond individual judges to the entire legal system. He viewed the courts as corrupt institutions that protected the wealthy and powerful while oppressing ordinary citizens like himself. By the late 1980s, Walter Moody had exhausted all legal avenues for overturning his 1972 conviction. Moody had exhausted the appeals process by early 1990, but his obsession with revenge had only intensified. He began developing a plan that would shock the nation and forever change how the federal court system approached security. Walter's plan was both sophisticated and calculated. He would construct mail bombs similar to the one that had injured his first wife, but these devices would be more powerful and more carefully targeted. His goal was to kill federal judges and others he blamed for his legal troubles. The bombs would be designed to kill their intended recipients while appearing to be random acts of terrorism. Walter planned to include targets from the civil rights community to make investigators believe the attacks were motivated by racial hatred rather than personal revenge. Walter began acquiring the materials needed for his bombs. He purchased pipes, end caps, batteries, and other components from different suppliers to avoid suspicion. He also obtained explosives and timing devices that would make his bombs more deadly than his earlier attempt. The planning phase took months. Walter studied the routines of his intended victims, learning when they typically received mail and where they would be likely to open packages. He wanted to ensure that his bombs would reach their targets and cause maximum damage. Before we get to the moment that changed everything, the bomb that would kill a sitting federal judge, take a second to subscribe if you haven't already. This story is far from over, because what Moody did next would send shockwaves through the justice system, spark one of the largest investigations in FBI history, and leave a trail of terror disguised as holiday mail. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and stay with us, because the most chilling part of this story is just about to unfold. The morning of December 16, 1989, started like any other Saturday for Judge Robert Vance and his wife Helen. They were at their comfortable home in Mountain Brook, Alabama, an affluent suburb of Birmingham where many prominent families lived. The Christmas season was in full swing, and packages arriving at homes throughout the neighborhood were common. Judge Vance had been on the federal bench for many years and had developed a routine for handling correspondence and packages. He typically opened his mail in the kitchen, where he had good light and plenty of space to sort through documents. Helen was nearby, going about her morning activities. The package that arrived that morning was unremarkable in appearance. It was wrapped in plain brown paper and addressed to Judge Vance at his home address. There was nothing about the package that would have raised suspicions or suggested danger. It appeared to be just another piece of mail. When Judge Vance opened the package, the explosion was immediate and devastating. The bomb had been designed to kill, and it achieved its purpose instantly. The blast was so powerful that it could be heard throughout the neighborhood, and the kitchen was completely destroyed. Helen Vance was seriously injured in the explosion. She was rushed to the hospital with severe wounds from the blast and flying debris. The medical team worked to save her life, and she eventually recovered from her physical injuries, though the emotional trauma would last much longer. Neighbors responded immediately to the sound of the explosion. They found the Vance home in chaos, with smoke and debris everywhere. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do for Judge Vance. The news of Judge Vance's murder sent shockwaves through the legal community. Federal judges had been threatened before, but the actual murder of a sitting federal appeals court judge was unprecedented. The attack represented a direct assault on the federal court system and the rule of law. Law enforcement agencies responded with massive resources. The FBI took the lead in the investigation, working with federal prosecutors, the ATF, and other agencies. They had no way of knowing that Walter Moody's plan was just beginning to unfold. On Monday, December 18, 1989, Robert "Robbie" Robinson arrived at his law office on Abercorn Street in Savannah, Georgia, ready to start another week of fighting for civil rights and justice. His practice focused on representing clients who had been discriminated against, and he had built a reputation as a skilled and dedicated attorney. On December 18, 1989, Robinson was tragically killed by a mail bomb that was sent to his Savannah office. The package appeared to be routine business mail, the type that attorneys receive regularly from courts, clients, and other legal professionals. When Robinson opened the package, the explosion killed him instantly. The bomb was similar in construction to the one that had killed Judge Vance 2 days earlier, but investigators would not immediately make this connection. The targeting of an African-American civil rights attorney suggested a different motive from the murder of a federal judge. The explosion occurred during normal business hours, and other people in the building were endangered by the blast. Robinson's secretary and other office workers were traumatized by the event, though they were not physically injured. The entire building had to be evacuated as a safety precaution. News of Robinson's murder spread quickly through Savannah's legal and civil rights communities. He had been a respected figure who had worked tirelessly for justice and equality. His death was seen as a direct attack on the civil rights movement and an attempt to intimidate other activists. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation joined federal agents in investigating Robinson's murder. Initially, they focused on the possibility that the attack was motivated by racial hatred or opposition to civil rights activities. This was exactly the misdirection that Walter Moody had planned. The murder of two prominent legal figures within 48 hours triggered one of the largest federal investigations in FBI history. The Bureau immediately recognized that these were not random acts of violence but carefully planned attacks on the American legal system. The investigation would eventually involve hundreds of agents and multiple federal agencies. FBI Director William Sessions personally oversaw the investigation, emphasizing the critical importance of solving these crimes. The murder of a federal judge represented a direct attack on the federal court system, and the Bureau was determined to bring the perpetrator to justice regardless of the resources required. The investigation began with a careful analysis of the bomb components and the packages used to deliver them. ATF explosives experts examined every fragment of the devices, looking for clues about their construction and the materials used. The bomb showed sophisticated construction techniques that suggested the bomber had significant technical knowledge. Postal inspectors traced the path of the packages through the mail system. They examined records from post offices throughout the Southeast, looking for patterns and clues about when and where the packages had been mailed. This painstaking work would eventually provide important evidence about the bomber's location and activities. The investigation expanded rapidly as more bombs were discovered. Federal agents intercepted a package addressed to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta before it could explode. A fourth bomb was found at the Jacksonville office of the NAACP. The discovery of these additional devices confirmed that the attacks were part of a coordinated campaign. ATF experts worked carefully to defuse the unexploded bombs, providing investigators with intact devices to analyze. The construction techniques were identical to those used in the bombs that had killed Judge Vance and Robinson, proving that all the attacks were the work of the same person. The investigation initially focused on potential suspects with connections to white supremacist groups. The targeting of civil rights leaders suggested racial motivation, and agents compiled lists of known extremists who might have the skills and motivation to carry out such attacks. However, some investigators began to question whether the civil rights angle was a deliberate misdirection. The primary target appeared to be Judge Vance, with the other attacks possibly intended to confuse investigators about the true motive for the crimes. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source. An ATF explosives expert was contacted by a colleague who had helped examine one of the unexploded bombs. The colleague mentioned that the device reminded him of something he had seen many years before, and he remembered a name: Walter Moody. The connection to Moody's 1972 bombing case was immediately investigated. Agents pulled the old files and compared the construction techniques used in the 1972 bomb with those used in the recent attacks. The similarities were striking and unmistakable. The government's investigation determined that only one pipe bomb in all its records matched the characteristics of the 4 mail bombs in this case, by containing end plates secured by threaded rods or bolts in a box designed for mailing. The one recovered from Moody's residence in 1972. This signature construction technique became the key evidence linking Moody to the crimes. With Walter Moody identified as the primary suspect, the investigation intensified dramatically. Agents began 24-hour surveillance of Moody and his wife Susan McBride. They monitored his activities, tracked his purchases, and analyzed his communications. The investigation revealed that Moody had been conducting extensive appeals of his 1972 conviction, many of which had been heard by judges in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Judge Vance had been involved in denying one of these appeals, providing a clear motive for the attack. Federal agents obtained court-authorized wiretaps of Moody's phone conversations and surveillance of his home. They discovered that Moody had been purchasing materials that could be used to construct bombs. In February of 1990, Moody became aware that federal investigators and a federal grand jury were investigating his connection to the case. Despite this knowledge, he continued his activities and even attempted to obstruct the investigation. The evidence against Moody continued to mount. Handwriting analysis linked him to the addresses on the packages, and fingerprint evidence connected him to materials used in the bombs. On July 13, 1990, federal agents executed arrest warrants for Walter Leroy Moody Jr. and his wife Susan McBride. The arrests were carefully coordinated to prevent Moody from destroying evidence or fleeing. Teams of FBI agents surrounded their home and took both suspects into custody without incident. After an extensive investigation, Moody and his second wife, Susan McBride, were arrested on July 13, 1990. McBride was released on $250,000 bail within a week and later testified against Moody pursuant to an immunity agreement. Her cooperation would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. The arrest of Walter Moody marked the end of a 7-month investigation that had consumed enormous resources and involved hundreds of federal agents. The case had been one of the FBI's highest priorities, and the successful identification and arrest of the bomber was a significant victory for federal law enforcement. The charges against Moody were extensive and carried the possibility of the death penalty. He was charged with the murders of Judge Vance and Robinson, as well as with mailing the bombs to the Atlanta courthouse and the Jacksonville NAACP office. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the prosecution was seeking the maximum penalties. Months after his federal trial ended, an Alabama grand jury indicted Mr. Moody on 2 counts of capital murder for the death of Judge Vance, and 1 count of assault in the first degree for injuries suffered by Judge Vance's wife. The state charges provided an additional avenue for prosecution. The arrest generated significant media attention throughout the country. The case had captured public interest because of the unprecedented nature of the attacks on federal judges and civil rights leaders. The revelation that the bomber had been motivated by personal revenge rather than racial hatred was a surprise to many observers. Federal prosecutors began preparing for what they knew would be a complex and challenging trial. The case involved multiple jurisdictions, sophisticated evidence, and a defendant who had demonstrated his willingness to kill federal judges. The prosecution team was led by future FBI Director Louis Freeh, who brought considerable experience to the case. Moody's defense team faced the difficult task of defending a client against overwhelming evidence. The physical evidence linking him to the bombs was extensive, and his wife's testimony would be damaging. The defense would need to find ways to challenge the evidence and create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. The trial began in 1991 with intense media attention and extraordinary security measures. The courthouse was surrounded by federal agents, and all spectators were subjected to thorough security screening. The murder of a federal judge had shaken the entire court system, and no risks were taken with the safety of those involved in the trial. Judge Edward Devitt of the District of Minnesota was brought in to preside over the trial. The selection of an outside judge was necessary because all judges in the 11th Circuit had recused themselves due to their connection to the murdered judge. Judge Devitt brought decades of experience to what would be one of the most important federal trials of the decade. The prosecution team was led by Louis Freeh, who would later become FBI director. Freeh and his colleagues presented a methodical case that linked Moody to the bombs through physical evidence, witness testimony, and his own recorded statements. The prosecution's case was built on the foundation of scientific evidence and careful investigative work. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the evidence linking Moody's 1972 bomb to the 1989 attacks. The government's investigation determined that only one pipe bomb in all its records matched the characteristics of the 4 mail bombs in this case, by containing end plates secured by threaded rods or bolts in a box designed for mailing, the one recovered from Moody's residence in 1972. Susan McBride's testimony was devastating to Moody's defense. She described her husband's obsession with his legal appeals and his increasingly erratic behavior in the months before the attacks. Her cooperation with the prosecution provided crucial insider information about Moody's activities and state of mind. The defense team faced an almost impossible task. The physical evidence against Moody was overwhelming, and the prosecution had built a solid case linking him to every aspect of the crimes. The defense strategy focused on challenging the scientific evidence and questioning the motives of prosecution witnesses. Moody's recorded statements, while under surveillance, provided additional evidence of his guilt. Federal agents had obtained court authorization to monitor his activities, and his own words linked him to the crimes. The recordings captured Moody discussing details of the bombings that only the perpetrator would know. The trial lasted several weeks, with the prosecution presenting hundreds of pieces of evidence and dozens of witnesses. The complexity of the case required careful explanation of the scientific evidence and the investigative techniques used to solve the crimes. On June 28, 1991, after weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury reached their verdict. Based on the extensive investigative work of the FBI, the ATF, the IRS, the U.S. Marshals, the Georgia State Police, and many others, the jury found Moody guilty of more than 70 charges and sentenced him to life in prison. The conviction represented a complete victory for federal prosecutors and law enforcement. The federal conviction was followed by state proceedings in Alabama. Months after his federal trial ended, an Alabama grand jury indicted Moody on 2 counts of capital murder for the death of Judge Vance and 1 count of assault in the first degree for injuries suffered by Judge Vance's wife. The state charges provided prosecutors with the opportunity to seek the death penalty. In 1997, an Alabama state court jury convicted Moody of Judge Vance's murder and sentenced him to death by electrocution, the standard method of execution in Alabama at the time. The state conviction ensured that Moody would face the ultimate punishment for his crimes, even though he was already serving multiple life sentences in federal prison. Moody was transferred to Alabama's Death Row at the Holman Correctional Facility near Atmore, where he would spend the next 21 years. From February 13, 1997, until his execution, Moody continued to file appeals and legal motions, maintaining his innocence and challenging his convictions through every available legal avenue. During his time on death row, Moody's behavior remained problematic. Around 2015, he was alleged to have attempted to run a Ponzi scheme from his death row cell, according to an anonymous elderly Florida woman who claimed to have received a letter with a Holman Correctional Facility return address from Moody. However, Moody was not known to have faced any disciplinary action as a result of this allegation. On February 23, 2018, Alabama set an execution date for Moody, April 19, 2018. The announcement marked the end of decades of legal proceedings and appeals. Moody's attorneys continued to file last-minute appeals, but the courts rejected all attempts to halt the execution. On April 19, 2018, at 8:42 p.m., Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was executed by lethal injection at the Holman Correctional Facility. Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was initially sentenced to death by electrocution in 1997. At that time, electrocution was the standard method of execution in Alabama. However, by the time his execution was actually carried out in 2018, Alabama had changed its default method to lethal injection, unless the inmate specifically chose electrocution. Moody did not opt for the electric chair, so he was ultimately executed by lethal injection. At age 83 years and 26 days, he became the oldest death row inmate to be executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, surpassing the previous record set by John B. Nixon Sr., who was executed in Mississippi in December 2005 at age 77. Moody declined to make a final statement before his execution. His last meal consisted of Philly cheesesteaks, Dr. Pepper, and M&Ms. The execution was witnessed by family members of his victims, law enforcement officials, and members of the media. The execution of Walter Moody brought closure to one of the most significant domestic terrorism cases in American history. The case had lasting impact on federal court security and demonstrated the effectiveness of interagency cooperation in solving complex crimes. The investigation and prosecution of Walter Moody represented a watershed moment for federal law enforcement. The case involved the largest deployment of FBI resources in the agency's history up to that point, and demonstrated the Bureau's commitment to protecting the federal judiciary. The successful resolution of the case sent a clear message that attacks on federal judges would be met with the full force of federal law enforcement. The case also highlighted the importance of scientific evidence in criminal prosecutions. The forensic analysis of the bomb components and the linking of Moody's 1972 device to the 1989 attacks showed how advances in forensic science could solve even the most complex cases. The evidence was so compelling that it overcame Moody's attempts to conceal his involvement through misdirection and careful planning. Helen Vance, Judge Vance's widow, lived to see her husband's killer executed. She had suffered both physical and emotional trauma from the bombing, but had shown remarkable strength throughout the legal proceedings. Her survival and recovery became a symbol of resilience in the face of terrorism. The families of Robert Robinson also found some measure of closure with Moody's execution. Robinson's death had deprived the civil rights community of a dedicated advocate, and his murder had been intended to intimidate others working for social justice. The successful prosecution of his killer vindicated his memory and his life's work. The case became the subject of extensive media coverage and academic study. It was featured in the television series Forensic Files and became a case study in law enforcement training programs. The investigation techniques and prosecutorial strategies used in the case influenced how similar crimes would be investigated and prosecuted in the future. Walter Moody's execution marked the end of a criminal career that spanned nearly 5 decades. From his first bombing in 1972 to his execution in 2018, Moody had demonstrated a pattern of violence and obsession with the legal system that ultimately cost him his life. His case serves as a reminder of the importance of protecting those who serve in the federal judiciary and the consequences of choosing violence over legal remedies for grievances against the system. If this case moved you, share the story. Let it be a warning about the power of hatred and a tribute to the persistence of justice. Subscribe to this channel for more real-life crime stories that matter. And remember, behind every headline is a human life forever changed.